Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In last week's podcast, we offered part 1 of the story in which Elijah challenged 450 prophets of the deity, Baal, to determine which god would show up and supply fire for a sacrifice. Of course, the deities in question were Baal and the Israelite god, known by the letters YHWH. This is often referred to as the Tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of God. That story is narrated in 1 Kings 18. We concluded last week's episode at the point in the story when Baal's prophets were unsuccessful in getting their God to show up when they called on him. As well, now that it was Elijah's turn to call on his God, before he even tried, he had the sacrifice and the wood for the fire doused with water 3 times in succession. Apparently, the prophet wanted to make sure that no one accused him of any trickery. Elijah was demonstrating his belief that his deity would have no trouble overcoming the obstacle presented by a drenched sacrificial animal or soaked wood. At this point, Elijah summons his God. That's in verse 36 of chapter 18. He refers again to his deity by using the distinct name, and then also by noting that his deity just happens to be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. Israel, of course, is Jacob's changed name. But this is more than an invocation. Elijah wants his God to make sure that everyone witnessing will soon know that, 1, you are the God of Israel, that 2, I, Elijah, am your servant, and 3, that I have done all these things according to your word. Then twice Elijah asks the Lord to quote-unquote answer me. That's in verse 37. Primarily so that this people, that is, the Israelites who are present for this contest, realize that you are God and that you have turned their hearts back. Right then, the Lord's fire fell, consumed the offering, the wood, the stone, and the dust, and even licked up the water that was in the trench from the previous drenching. That's in verse 38. In short, everything that could be burnt, and for that matter, everything that could not normally be burnt, was burnt. God's fire settled the contest once and for all. Obviously, this spectacular sight had the intended effect. When the people saw what had just happened, they fell on their faces and proclaimed that the Israelite deity was without question God. For emphasis, they said it twice. That's in verse 39. That concluded Elijah's efforts to convince the people. But the prophet was not done with the prophets of Baal. He ordered that they be seized and be brought to the brook Kishon. He, referring to Elijah, killed these prophets right then and there. That's in verse 40. The scene shifts swiftly to Elijah's once more confronting Ahab, the king. Remember that the whole area had been in a drought for a considerable amount of time, but that was soon to end. Elijah tells King Ahab to go, eat, and drink, since rain is on the way. That's in verse 41. Ahab did as Elijah said. He left and was about to eat and drink. In the meantime, Elijah went back up to the top of Mount Carmel, where he bowed and put his face between his knees. That's in verse 42. Presumably, this posture reflected a time of desperate prayer. Elijah then told a servant to look toward the sea. The servant did this, but reported that he saw nothing. That's in verse 43. Elijah wanted him to look again. This time around he needed to look 7 times. Once more the servant complied, and finally on the 7th time he saw something. The servant said he had seen a little cloud, small as a man's hand, and that cloud was rising out of the sea. At that juncture, Elijah told his servant to go and find Ahab and tell him that he should prepare his chariot and go down, since it was about to pour rain. Sure enough, clouds and winds arose, and it began to rain hard. Clearly, the drought was over, all because of what Elijah had said and what the Israelite God had done. Ahab rode all the way to Jezreel on his chariot. That's in verse 45. This episode concludes with the notation that the hand of the Lord was on Elijah. The last thing we are told, however, involves another amazing feat, namely, the prophet girded up his loins, meaning, so to speak, that he prepared himself for what he was about to do, and he ran to Jezreel. Of course, what was amazing about this was that Elijah, though on foot, beat Ahab, who was riding in a chariot to Jezreel. The question is, what are we to make of a story like this? After all, it has elements that are difficult to stomach. It is one thing to disagree with the theological tenets and religious outlooks of those following Baal or any other deity, or any other combination of deities. But this contest was more than a verbal altercation. It ended up with a slaughtering of the prophets of Baal. Also, the story depicts God as being completely sovereign over weather, not to mention other elements. If God wants rain to come, rain appears. If God prevents rain, famine ensues. God's fire can even burn water. The final matter that is so startling is that Elijah can run faster than any chariot. Once again, we pose the question, what are we to make of a story like this? Some people would answer that question by saying that this story simply describes what took place. Because the Bible is true, its stories are always historical. An unhistorical Bible is an untrue Bible. But is that the case? I would suggest that that is not the case. The Bible is in a very complex way based on history, meaning that it deals with real people and real events. But that historical element has to be dealt with very carefully. The Bible is primarily a religious or theological book. Plus, it is often the case that its religious or theological outlook has been in a way historicized. That is, the Bible often tells a story to make this or that religious or theological point. That is why there are so many contradictions among the stories which could not be reconciled with a fundamentally historical book. For example, the creation story in Genesis 1 tells us that God created everything that exists in 7 24-hour days. Actually 6, because God rested on the 7th. And in that story, humanity was created as the last part of the created order. we learn that on the sixth day, God created humanity as male and female simultaneously. However, in Genesis 2, the Lord first plants a garden and then fashions a man from the ground to be the gardener. Soon the Lord does not like the fact that the man is alone. To remedy the situation, the Lord fashions out of the same ground from which the deity made the man the animal kingdom. The man names all the animals. But that did not solve the problem. The man was still profoundly alone. So the Lord takes a part of the man and fashions a woman. Genesis 1 tells us about a simultaneous creation of male and female after the creation of animals. Genesis 2 tells us that a man preceded the fashioning of animals, after which, that is, after the animals were fashioned, a woman was fashioned. Both stories are true and underscore differing theological emphases, but neither are historical. Indeed, insisting that they are historical has led to playing fast and loose about what the text actually says. Many other similar examples are to be found in the Bible. Back to the episode involving Elijah and the prophets of Baal. A number of theological or religious issues are in play in this story. One issue involves whether one should acknowledge many gods or a singular deity. In the biblical world, the vast majority of polytheists would have had little difficulty in accepting many gods. Polytheists were not into the exclusive recognition of one god. Each god was more or less a specialist, excelling in a particular area, but relatively uninvolved in another area. Israelites were very different in this regard. They thought that their God had mastered every specialty, so to speak. In addition, in time, the Israelites came to believe that its God was the only deity that actually existed. In the story as related in 1 Kings 18, the emphasis is mainly on the fact that Baal did not appear when summoned. Of course, one might conclude that that was because Baal did not exist. But one could just as easily conclude that Baal simply did not show up, as the taunts about Baal's going to the bathroom or being on a trip suggest. Of course, there is a huge moral issue that besets this account. Elijah slaughtered the 450 prophets of Baal. One wonders how many so-called heretics were executed over the centuries due to texts just like this one in 1 Kings 18. However, the slaughter itself may hint at a reason why we are not to see this episode in starkly historical terms. Elijah killed the prophets apparently single-handedly. That's in verse 40. As Elijah killed these prophets one by one, what did the others do as they witnessed this? Did they take numbers and wait in line? Did they wait for Elijah to say, "Next"? The scene is absurd as a historical description. Elijah perhaps could have killed one or two, but the rest, seeing this horrific spectacle, would have bolted and gotten out as fast as humanly possible. A counter-argument that Elijah had help in carrying out the slaughter of 450 men is belied in the very next chapter when the prophet complains that he is all by himself in representing the Lord. That's in verse 19 of verse 10 of chapter 19. In any case, This story is not designed to tell us how to deal with those with whom we disagree in theological or religious terms. Our job is to persuade, not kill. Also, the way the episode ends lets us know that we are dealing with something besides history. Ahab is headed back to Jezreel in a chariot. Elijah, though, is headed in the same direction, but on foot. With God's help, Elijah somehow got there before the king. It is not clear how we to understand Elijah's blazing speed in this last part of the story. Perhaps we are to conclude that no miracle is beyond the capacity of the Israelite God. That conclusion leads to a final point. If God is able, whenever God wants to change weather patterns or intercede in an event like this, then we might legitimately ask why God does not do this more often or even at more opportune times. Human beings have suffered terribly from horrible weather ever since they have been on this planet. Does God ever really change bad weather? Think in terms of hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, floods, even earthquakes, to alleviate human suffering. For that matter, a deity who could intervene in the manner such as 1 Kings 18 suggests would be culpable for not intervening in something like the Holocaust or World War I or the American Civil War. That list could go on and on and on. Whatever we are to make of the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, it seems not to lie in the direction of a mere historical account. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.